Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Christensen. This is Horror 101 with Dr. AC, celebrating classic horror throughout history with new episodes every Friday night. Tonight we're going to be celebrating a triple feature of mummy movies. The original 1932 Mummy, directed by Karl Freund and starring Boris Karloff. The 1959 Hammer version with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, directed by Terence. Then we're going to jump ahead to the 25th anniversary of the 1999 version, directed by Sommers and starring Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz.
Death, eternal punishment for anyone who opens this casket.
Supernatural powers that once released can live again in our modern world. The Mummy, the living dead, bringing terror and death across 4,000 years.
Are we going into battle?
There's something out there. Something underneath that sand.
They came to uncover its secrets.
Mummies, my good son. This is where they made the mummies.
The Mummy.
In the spirit of the holidays with unwrapping and violating family curses and things like that, we're going to be talking about three, I don't know if we could say classic versions of this story, but certainly three versions of it. And I've got an awesome panel to chat about it with me. Let's bring everybody in and let's say hello to Gavin Schmitt.
Hello. Hiding in a back office today.
Doug Long.
Hello.
And Michael Weber.
Hi. It's good to be back.
And we're going to be chatting about The Mummy from 1932, Universal Studios, and then The Mummy, 1959 from Hammer, and then once again back to Universal for The Mummy, 1999. And we're not going to talk about that Tom Cruise thing for at least another 20 years. Thanks for coming on the show, everybody, and welcome. Gavin, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on. And I'm going to kick things off with you because we're going to be talking about The Mummy, 1932, and I know you have written a biography of Karl Freund, who is our director of this film. This is his debut film. Tell us a little bit about what drew you to Mr. Freund and to this film in particular.
Actually, it was completely backwards. My all-time favorite horror film, and still to this day, is Mad Love, 1935's Mad Love, which is also directed by Karl Freund. So the project has started out with me really researching the movie, like in detail, trying to find the background information, scripts, all that stuff. And then once it started growing to a point where it was beyond the realm of an article, it became a book level. And then I had to start adding all the other things in that Freund did, most of which, quite frankly, I don't care about, but they made it in there. The Mummy I do care about, though. The Mummy is his first American directorial film. You know, I'm not going to say it's like the best of the Universal monsters. I think that'd be a hard sell, but it's definitely a classic of the Universal monster series. I mean, the Mummy is an archetype to this day, so definitely a solid start. And
Doug, how about you? Where did you come to The Mummy 1932?
No, it was either from Sammy Terry in Central Indiana or Creature Features in Chicago in the 70s. That one I saw ages ago.
Yeah, because it was part of the Shock Theater package, those films that went out in 1957, 1958, and took TV by storm and turned a whole bunch of us into monster kids. Michael, how about you?
Well, I think I probably saw bits and pieces of it from Creature Features, but I remember the first full viewing of it was actually in the theater at the old Three Penny Theater that used to be here in Chicago on Lincoln Avenue. And I remember going to see it and appreciating the fact that it was so improbable that this of the Universal monster movies would have been shown in a theater, in a reprise theater. So it was great seeing it, with a big audience on the big screen.
Yeah, actually, I've never seen this on the big screen, which is, I've seen most of the Universals, and I think part of it is because, as you were kind of alluding, Gavin, like this is, I don't know if the Mummy is anyone's favorite Universal monster. It feels like, the Wolfman and Dracula, Frankenstein, Creature from Black Lagoon, those will always be, for whatever reason, more resonant for monster kids. But it absolutely is on the Mount Rushmore of Universal monsters. And it, in watching it again through 2024 eyes, I was actually quite taken with it and impressed with it as a film. I think the monster itself is kind of so-so, but as a film, it actually does tell a really nice story. This being Freund's first assignment, do you know how he came to this project? Because he was working as a cinematographer prior to that.
I don't know the details of how it ended up with him, other than the fact that he had wanted to be a director after being a cinematographer. And I guess, Carl Laemmle or whoever thought, you showed us what you could do on Dracula. You obviously got the background with Metropolis and all that. We'll give it a shot. And The Mummy, as far as a directorial debut, I like it. And I think the story is very strong, but it's still, the production itself is rather stagey, similar to like how Dracula is very stagey. So it's not as involved as maybe some directors may have done it. So it's an easy way into the director's chair, I would say.
Yeah. And watching that opening sequence where you do see Freund moving his camera around more than is required. Like that sequence could have been much stagier. And I like the fact that he is using a lot of camera angles and moving around the box and things like that.
Even though he's not the cinematographer, I like to think that he had a hand in that. Like there's the scene where the camera like looms over like the pool where you see back in time. I can't say that he told the cameraman to do that, but I feel like he probably did.
I feel like he probably told him to. This is also Boris Karloff kind of coming off of Frankenstein and Old Dark House, and this is him. Like, this is Karloff, the Uncanny. He had just done Mask of Fu Manchu, I think, prior to this. So this is him kind of becoming a horror star. Doug, did you have some thoughts on Karloff in this iteration?
Yeah, I think he really understood film acting, especially this is still very early in the sound era. He understood the camera is very close. You don't need to overdo it. Of course, the great shot is, we're barely into the movie, is the close-up when his eyes start to open. Doesn't need to do much more than that. And then later, when we see him, as the human interacting with them, even then there's a real stillness about him that carries power while everybody else is, active and worried. Yeah, I think he really mastered it early on.
And I was doing some math, and I mean, if it's not exactly his 90th, according to IMDb, like it's right around there in terms of his screen credits. He'd been working since 1919. And so he'd been around for a long time. And of course, the famous story of him being discovered in the commissary for the Frankenstein monster, like he'd been jobbing at Universal and various other studios for a while.
I think more than any of the other Mummy movies that we're going to talk about, there is a real acting performance. There's a range of this character that we see a bit of, certainly within the Frankenstein monster's range of sadness, of fear, of watching him work through things. But here also you add on this romantic longing. He's a lover in this film. And he certainly had, Doug is pointing out his eyes, which were so terrifying in the moment when he opens them up as the mummy, but even more so, I think, in the moment when they're bandaging him and you see him acknowledging what is happening to him. It is truly a tour de force performance that when you think of in a horror film, he's giving this as much as any actor would give to any great role. He just makes a meal out of it. And I would imagine that, Karl Freund is probably thrilled that he's got an actor who's going, just do you. I'm going to capture you and light you so well. All of these wonderful little special effects with the dots of light on his eyes that, you know, you get two people working together of him going, I know exactly what to do with this, and probably Freund going, and I know exactly how to showcase what you're going to do. It has an artfulness to it that, you know, kind of can go up against James Whale in terms of going great director in his moment with a great actor.
If you put this one alongside Dracula, alongside Frankenstein, we have a different vision each time. And it's fun to see Browning, Whale, and Freund kind of doing their monster debuts. Other folks that familiar faces that would pop up from this, of course, are also veterans of Dracula and Frankenstein, in that we have David Manners as our young lover. And then we have Edward Van Sloan, who's in a very similar Van Helsing role.
That's one of the real unfortunates about this film, is that you almost always walk out of it and go, God, it just feels like a reboot of Dracula.
Yeah.
In prepping for this, I saw that John Balderston, who wrote the screenplay, had written Dracula and just literally pulled on some of those elements.
But I know Balderston was also a big history buff. And so this was an opportunity for him to kind of marry the Tutankhamun, excavation with the Dracula mythos. And I think it pans out pretty well. I like that Edward Van Sloan is not as powerful a figure as his Van Helsing. He just seems a little outclassed by Ardith Bay in a way that he was feeling like he could take on Dracula.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too, Balderston being an important player in this, because it began as an entirely different movie, as a film called Cagliostro, I believe it was, about the ancient magician, and then evolved into this. So then you see people bringing, their elements of interest, or I would imagine certainly Karl Freund, remembering what he had done on Dracula and probably incorporating that. I do wonder, and I don't know, Gavin, did he ever say anything about his impression of the other Dracula? Because he always gets sort of a bad rap in comparison to, like what Aaron, what you're talking about is suddenly the camera's moving around where it was
Spanish Dracula.
Right. Was there anything ever said about from his point of view?
Not that I know. He did not give a lot of interviews throughout his life. And when he did, it was always very strange things. But yeah, his reflections on individual movies tend to be more technical. He wrote a lot of technical papers saying how he did things, but very little reflections on a personal level. So yeah, I don't know his firsthand opinions of why he was limited on Dracula the way that he was. It's weird to hire a guy that's known for the on-chain camera and then make it a stage production, but that's what they did.
Well, and that's the thing, I guess, when you're building to this being the third whack by Universal. Old Dark House is certainly, within there, but they've learned a lot since Frankenstein and Dracula. They're understanding what are the elements, what are the archetypal characters, the sort of Van Helsing character. Oh, and just get the guy who does that Van Helsing thing.
Right.
And get the guy who does that, the David Manners thing. Well, he's available, So there's so many repeatable sort of tracks within this, because it's almost like Universal's figuring out the ingredients and now just mix it together.
Well, let's talk about that opening scene, because I feel like it's a great opening. It does invite us in, and we're ready for more Mummy after those first 10 minutes. As we talked about, we get that moving camera. We get the mythos laid out pretty clearly. We get established, there's Van Helsing, and now he's going to lay out the Egyptian curse for us. And then we have Jack Pierce's makeup, which reportedly took 8 hours to apply for that one shot of Karloff as Imhotep in the coffin. And you get that great shot of the eyelid just opening enough to get that little glimmer of light coming out of his eye. It's a brilliant opening, and it culminates with our guy going insane.
The thing about it is that it's so they keep not showing you things, and that's what I remember. As a kid, seeing that scene, because the scene was so famous, and being terrified not by the mummy, which you're thinking the mummy and Lon Chaney, but it was about the reaction was so terrifying to go, what would make this hardy, wisecracky, smartass young guy into this quivering, terrified bowl of Jello. What did he just see? I mean, it's so brilliant that of them not showing you anything. And we've seen the photos of Karloff in full body, but we never get any shot like that in the film.
Right. And there's a funny little anecdote because Jack Pierce also designed kind of the mummy costume, as it were, because Karloff was going to be in it for so long. They quickly realized that he had not incorporated anywhere that could be unzipped so that one could relieve themselves during the course of your performing day. So that was an awkward moment for Pierce and Karloff.
You know, one thing that I learned in prepping this is, I knew that the King Tut opening was a phenomenon in the 1920s, but I hadn't really realized that every time anybody connected to it died, the newspapers would talk about a curse connected with it. So by the time audiences in 1932 saw this opening scene, they would right away click with, a pop culture. And I think that permeates this and even the films that were made later.
Yeah, when you think of the proximity to when those activities were happening, it was very present then. It wasn't like they were reflecting back on it.
I'd like to jump off of something Doug just said, and that it was interesting in looking up The Mummy, the film, finding out that there were at least a dozen Mummy movies made before it, which I don't think any exist to this day. But I would love to know what those were, and love to know if Universal was borrowing any of these tropes, or because we say they established them, but maybe this was already something that was growing out of the King Tut thing. I don't know, and I love that the mummy mythos is all just coming out of this one incident. Egypt had been popular for decades, but that King Tut thing, for whatever reason, just latched onto people.
Well, and I thought it was interesting that they talked about, they have the mention, and we'll definitely talk about this when we get to the Hammer film, but the notion of, these English archaeologists being angry that they have to keep their finds in Cairo. And it's like, why can't we take it? Why can't we keep it? And it's like, do you hear yourself? Like, are you reading the room here? I think we are supposed to recognize that colonial quality, but I'm not 100% sure.
Even today, when you look at architecture that was built around that time, how much that Egyptian exoticizing of it, turned up in American architecture. I mean, in different buildings still, it was incredibly influential. And I guess everybody was just devouring any bits of it that they could fashion in art and architecture and things like that.
Well, the movie palaces, I think that Grauman's Egyptian theater was maybe 1927. So and the ones across the country.
Right here on Clark Street in Chicago, the Remy, those storage buildings were all built to look like Egyptian tombs, projecting that if you have valuables, the safest place you could put them in is something that looks like an Egyptian tomb.
Of course.
Speaking of borrowing and lore, it's interesting, we didn't mention it too, at the top of this movie, inexplicably the music is Swan Lake again.
Yes. Well, and I think we were joking about that when we talked about the Hound of the Baskervilles, that, I don't know why they kept going back to Swan Lake, but, like it worked before, we might as well use that. Like, is that going to be the recurring motif?
It'll trigger an audience to think this is a horror movie.
One of the things I really liked was that kind of the opening where you have that kind of pyramid on a swivel that kind of clicks into place before you get the title card. Who's in charge of this like cool little model that doesn't really do anything other than provide a really cool opening title sequence?
I wondered when I saw that of going, was this them again in reaction to the staticness of Dracula? Was this Freund in some way kind of going, no, this is going to move. This is going to be,
from the get-go.
You're going to get it right from the minute we get it. It seems very deliberate.
And one of the things that I also noticed during that opening sequence was there's no music. We just talked about the Swan Lake, but like it goes into just silence while he's doing his translation, while he's contemplating whether to open it up or not. And it's super quiet. And we commented on that in the Hound of the Baskervilles as well. But the fact that they really were using silence in a time when you would think this is the time to start building mood. And I can only imagine that was a choice that Freund was making.
No, that's such a good point, Aaron. And I always think that Bride of Frankenstein was the first Universal that like they finally got it together with the music and the visuals. Whereas I kind of keep going, is this just the clumsy transition from silent films going, we don't entirely know how, we're not thinking and fusing and going, oh no, that has to be part of the language from the get-go, or that it was just stuff added on after the fact. Of going, put some music here to do something,
And that really is the only time we see a mummy in the Mummy movie. It's that opening 10 minutes. And then it's Boris Karloff as Ardeth Bey, who is Imhotep in modern times. But it's interesting considering how much Mummy goes into the other Mummy movies, both with Universal and Hammer and beyond. The mythos of Ardeth Bey, you kind of alluded to it, Michael, that we really have a sympathetic character in Karloff. As dark as his intentions might seem to the outside, like he's coming from a very pure and lovelorn place.
And his killings are all connected to that, not just to
right. It's not vengeance.
In the sequel, they're not sequels exactly, but the movies that came in the 40s, those are more, he's a hitman, whereas here it's anybody that's getting in the way of being reunited with the princess.
Yes. And we should talk about the princess, Zita Johann, playing Helen. She lends a lot of presence, and I like her performance quite a bit. I know that there's a lot of stories about her conflict between her and Freund. I see you nodding, Gavin.
I know everybody here's heard it. Maybe the audience hasn't heard it, but
that's why you're here, man.
Yeah, but after the fact, again, like Freund didn't really give interviews, but Zita Johann did, and she more or less is not shy about saying she felt she was being tortured in the role, that he was pushing her to extremes that were wildly inappropriate. And she doesn't go into like a lot of detail about that, but her Hollywood career is not long. I think whatever happened was not what she was looking for.
She headed back to Broadway. So well used in this movie, though. I mean, she's got the look. She's sort of got a look of the Brides of Dracula, and the year before. But the early scene where she's dancing and then is possessed, it's such a nice transition when she starts walking to the museum.
She's great, and I wish that there was more of it, because my understanding is there were several reincarnation scenes that ultimately got cut for whatever reason. So she had a variety of incarnations that we never really get to see and never will.
When you read up a little on her, she almost seems like an early, like a Moscow art theater kind of actor, or an actor's studio. Like her whole level of investment in character and believing what she was doing, elevates. You sense something. This is not a early 1930s type of film actor struggling with the transition from silent movies or any of that stuff, or the theater voice kind of actor that seemed like you're just too big for the screen. She had something going on, and apparently she truly believed in reincarnation herself as a person and wanted to respect and demanded that they respect these elements of it in the filming. So I think you're getting an opportunity here to watch just a really unique person in a moment who just probably, like Louise Reiner, would not have been able to survive in the Hollywood system, who was just almost too good for these guys cranking out movies. She had to, like Doug says, go back to Broadway, which is where she really had a very healthy career, doing all kinds of things from the classics to musicals to all kinds of things. But it's one of those rare opportunities to watch an actor who was almost unable to be tamed by what was required to be in films. Just go, sure, you're going to tell me I've got to do nude scenes? Bring them on. You're going to abuse me and not give me a chair on the set? Bring it on. I'm going to use all of that to put it into, what's going on behind my eyes. And it's horrible. I don't know whether Freund was whether he was one of those sort of Hitchcockian geniuses where he was abusing this woman to get a performance out of her, or whether he was just so, terrified because it was his own first show, or he was looking for a scapegoat to say, well, it's her fault, she's difficult. Who knows?
Yeah, I would lean more towards the Hitchcock angle on that, because all later stories, he's a malicious person. He was a malicious person. The best documentation I have actually comes out of like his probate records, and his family had nothing but terrible things to say. Like, he was a real ass. So I mean, whether it was to get a better performance out of her or not, I guess that's debatable. But it wasn't that he didn't know what he was doing. It was that he took joy in terrorizing people. So
yeah.
And we will be talking about Mad Love next year as it celebrates its anniversary. But we were talking off camera. Freund was one of the innovators in television. And he worked with Lucille Ball on her show and kind of helped make it what it became. Doug, did you want to speak to that?
I think and Gavin, correct me if I'm wrong, I think he pretty much created the 3-camera setup that sitcoms used from then on.
That's right. Yeah, and that's one of the technical papers he laid out really well of how to, because apparently prior to that, it took forever to go from scene to scene because he had to keep taking down the lights and setting up new lights and new cameras. And he found a way to do close, middle, and far shots simultaneously without having to do that. And you still had a live audience that could see what was going on. That was the major problem, was with the live audience, you couldn't have that many cameras or people couldn't watch the show. But they found the way to get the cameras and lighting just right. And yes, my understanding is it was used for decades after.
When you see somebody, when you see that in a movie or a TV of like something happening at a TV station, it's always the 3 cameras that are moving around and the director up there going 1, 2, 1. Yeah, that was Karl Freund. Some person who doesn't get as much love, and perhaps deservedly so, is David Manners in this role. And the thing is, David Manners was an incredibly popular actor. And like actresses would say, oh my gosh, I'm working opposite David Manners, I know I've arrived. But like when you got Edward Van Sloan, you've got Karloff, and you got Zita Johann, he kind of fades into the background. He would come up against that time and again with, Dracula and the Black Cat. And it's just perhaps the things that we as horror fans know him from are ones where he's just a little outclassed by the folks around him.
He's useful in this, I think. He's not affected or anything. I buy that he and Zita Johann fall in love, but you're right. He's not the outgoing, memorable character in this.
He was another guy who, had a bit of a Broadway career. Interestingly, he was in a show called Truckline Cafe with Marlon Brando. And I go, David Manners just might have been one of those guys who was just so pretty. They didn't quite figure out yet the concept of the anti-hero, where he could have done something more than just be essentially a horror version of, Tennis, anyone, guy. So you wonder, like, what might have happened if other people had handled his career a little bit better. The one thing about this film that when the transition from him being Imhotep to being Ardith Bey, I always that struck me. How did he get?
Yeah, right.
Did he go to a hotel room and unwrap himself and go to a haberdashery and buy some clothes?
He's got 10 years to come up with that. I mean,
how did it happen?
Clearly has been using some moisturizer, but not enough moisturizer, because when we get those
how to speak English,
right? He's done it well.
But those close-ups of his face, that are kind of lit from below, you see all the wrinkles in his face. It's a striking image, and it's one that has become as popular as the shots of him.
I think it showed up 3 times, and it's got to be the same piece of film, but the one where he's about this close to the camera.
Yeah.
They're haunting.
There's a moment that always strikes me, and again, it's a tribute really to Karl Freund, I think, but I always think of it in terms of like later horror films that are dealing with extraterrestrials, and it's the scene where he's crouched down on the floor and the camera comes around his back and turns around, and then the lights move and he's back, and now he's somewhere in the darkness, gathering up his stuff, and he's, you know, it is a really disturbing scene, and it reminds me of things like Signs or whatever, you know, where it's live action and you're seeing the aliens, you know, move in the background, and I'm like, it's just really striking. You don't see a scene like that is all about misdirection in the film that early. It's such a smart precursor to, you know, Blair Witch or something like that. It's a really cool moment.
One final thought I have is literally about the ending, because this is a literal Deus Ex Machina, you know, where the gods just like go, oh, now you just stop that, you know. She prays to the goddess Isis, and Isis goes, yep. And the whole thing just wraps up really quick in that you're not even really sure, is she back? She never says anything. She just kind of looks up at David Mayer's character. As much as Dracula feels rushed, like the Mummy feels like, whoosh, okay, we're done. We got to get these people out in the lobby quick.
Double feature. Next movie.
Well, at least they didn't add on something lousy like Baron Frankenstein to the House of Frankenstein. They weren't great with the wrap-ups.
No.
The final scene.
Just let it breathe, guys.
Yeah.
Let's lunge ahead into 1959's The Mummy from Hammer. That is the fourth pairing of Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. Peter Cushing is once again playing our heroic character, and then Christopher Lee is playing the Mummy. And he spends much more of his time under the bandages than Karloff did. We do get a nice flashback sequence where we get to see Christopher Lee in his human guise, but he is very much a very different kind of mummy than what we had become accustomed to from the 40s entries from Universal. And I'm just going to out you right now, Michael. You sent an email saying you just finished it, and what was it? Oof.
You know, it was, honestly, I will say it was the first time I've ever watched it, and mainly because that film has sort of a bad rap. Coming after the Hammer, Frankenstein, and Dracula, it was generally, a lot that I've read considered it to be a bit of a letdown. The thing that struck me about it, as I always think about when it's with the Hammer films and sort of the gentleman's agreement that they have with Universal to remake their films while Universal got the distribution rights in America, was that this one is a remake using lore from both the 32 version, and it's kind of an actual remake of like two of the Chaney films, really. With those characters appearing. So I always think of those going, they have the entire series of Universal lore and universe to kind of pick and choose, which makes me think, you know, that with Christopher Lee, it's why you have a much more active mummy in the Lon Chaney mold.
Yes.
But him even going, yeah, but I'm not going to have the lumbering whatever. I'm just going to be full-bodied, you know, athleticism. It seemed pretty, you know, action-packed, and he attacks poor Peter Cushing, like 3 times in his house.
This was the first time that Universal had said, okay, you can use some of our story elements, because Jimmy Sangster, who wrote the screenplay for this as well, he was very much, his marching orders for Curse of Frankenstein and Horror of Dracula were, you can use the character because that's in the public domain, but you cannot use anything of our stories. Universal had their lawyers at the ready. And this was the first time that they were kind of like, okay, in exchange for us distributing the film, you can use some of the story elements. And so, yes, we do see elements in some ways that's to their benefit, and in some ways it's to their detriment, because Sangster is not forced to come up with something wholly original, which is kind of the things that I love about Curse of Frankenstein and Horror of Dracula.
And I think to Gavin's earlier point, which is to say we don't know, there isn't an existing story of the Mummy. It was a Universal film, wholly, and then built on by the subsequent reboots. They're really not the sequels in any way, but they're, you know, the whole reboot of it.
I rewatched the Hammer version this past week. It's been years I rewatched it. I hate to say it, I liked it. I mean, right away I was struck by, we mentioned earlier, about how it's sort of hinted at the colonialism in like the Universal version, but here it's like an overarching theme. And I love the fact that that theme is coming out of a British production, because like they're the colonizers. Like, it's a much more powerful message. But yeah, then we do get like this update on sort of the romance element, although it's not really that same level. And I did like the more active mummy. I wasn't as impressed with the costume. I mean, it looked more like pajamas with some straps hanging off of it. But Christopher Lee's great, of course. So I enjoyed watching him lunging at people and jumping through windows.
Yeah. This is a scary mummy. And I think that was always the joke. Lon Chaney's version of the mummy would never catch anybody. He's just slowly limping along. And here, Christopher Lee's not limping. He will come at you and he will mess you up. Doug, how about you? What were your thoughts on the Hammer one?
Well, sort of going off what Gavin said, it's very much a revenge story, much more like The Mummy's Hand and The Mummy's Tomb at Universal. And we get those older, kind of smug archaeologists. We know better than you locals what to do with this tomb. And then so we see revenge throughout the whole thing. And then, of course, the mummy himself with mixed emotions. And there's enough slit in through for Christopher Lee that we get to see some emotion as he sees the woman.
Yeah.
All of that. So, and also he makes two really great entrances into the house, just breaks through doors and windows.
Yeah. And I agree. In the same way that Karloff is very emotive with his eyes, Lee is absolutely using every tool available to him. And he was a mime. He had worked with mime before. And so kind of the stuff that he was doing in Curse of Frankenstein, he gets to kind of amplify here as another mute creature. But yes, his eyes are so communicative. He gets to do so much more than he was able to do in Frankenstein.
Well, and speaking of entrances, he gets one of the great entrances when he comes from the bog.
Yeah,
out of the water. That whole one, there's a similar, again, it's a similar entrance, and I don't remember. You might know whether it's Mummy's Curse or Mummy's Hand, or Anxanamen comes up out of the ground.
It's the last one, the Mummy's Curse, 1930.
Curse. Yeah. It's really disturbing, and this maybe they were take a note of that. That's awesome.
That's the one where she ends up in New Orleans somehow?
Yeah. Right, yeah. They started off in the East and ended up in New Orleans.
The natural progression of things, Egypt to New Orleans.
Slugs move.
Like that.
And we are joined by Mike Mayo. Thank you for coming on into the studio. What were your thoughts? I can't remember when you last saw the Hammer Mummy, but what were your thoughts this time around?
I guess I saw it the first time back when I was doing the first horror show book, when I was really doing a lot of the Hammer stuff. And that was at the same time that the really nice Anchor Bay VHS editions of the Hammer stuff was coming out. And seeing it again this time, I was really knocked out by the colors in it. Really like the way they used that. That just struck me as something that was so different from the earlier Universal version. I like what Lee did with it, just with the character and being so limited in for most of the film in what he could with both his face and his body movements. I thought he was just terrific in it, and it was just campy as could be all the way through.
Yeah, there's the mask that Lee is wearing. There's like wire underneath the bandages that is kind of making sure that no expression occurs. So it's only his eyes that are working. We talked about the colors. That's Jack Asher as our cinematographer, and he really was a Hammer all-star in terms of making those Hammer colors pop as much as they did. And we've got Terence Fisher back in the director's chair, and he'd done Horror of Dracula and Frankenstein and Hound of the Baskervilles earlier that year. So he was kind of their go-to Gothic guy. Gavin, what you were talking about, the colonialism, that's something I definitely would like to address, because the Mummy is clearly the monster in this film, but he's justified. He's being used as an instrument of vengeance, but it's a righteous vengeance.
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting. As I said, like because this is, again, a British production. And I don't know. I guess probably since the first time they started digging in Egypt, this was a thing. But it seems like more today, in our time, this has become more of the mainstream of, hey, museums, give your stuff back. And I love seeing this being such a central theme. I mean, right away in the first 5 minutes, it's made very clear the locals don't like it. Everybody doing the work looks like they're basically slave labor for these guys. I thought it was great that they addressed this so strongly at a time where this would have still been accepted. I don't know if it was a political statement, but it was a bold statement for the era.
It certainly made sense in some of the plot too.
Mike, you made a comment, and I never thought of it this way. You used the word camp as it applies to Hammer films, and I think about this when thinking about the lighting to some degree. And one of the things that strikes me when they go into the tomb, and it's that beautiful combination of green and purples and pinks, and I sit there as a director and I go, what's the source of these lights? They're in a 3,000-year-old tomb. Where is this gorgeous palette of light? So you're blowing my mind in terms of going, was this camp? Were they not, or were they intentionally trying to do it? I've never heard that as a possibility.
Well, remember, psychedelia was kind of going on, beginning to go on at the same time. And I think that may have had something to do with it. I just thought they were kind of cool.
Yeah.
That's funny. Actually, I hadn't even thought about that. But yeah, 1959, we see LSD on screen with William Castle's The Tingler. Yeah. So I mean, this is very much kind of leaning into that era.
Well, as far as the colors, all the Hammers use that so well to jump out and tell us it's not pure realism. In addition to the green of the tomb, there's a lot of red, the inside of the sarcophagus, somewhere in the house. I mean, just a lot of really bold primary colors, which make this above and beyond a realism kind of a horror story.
And I think too, they just tried to make them to use the lighting to make it look like a more expensive production than it was.
Right. That's Jack Asher and Bernard Robinson, our production designer. Like, he was always kind of the secret weapon for Hammer, because he would repurpose things and he would, turn the set around or dress it a different way.
They were so prolific. I was just looking. I can't believe how many of the Hammers were made in such a short period of time.
You seem particularly interested in that plot line with colonialism. Are you aware at all, were the creatives in Hammer at all trying to wrestle with any sort of, morality issues or political issues through these films? Certainly, Frankenstein opens up a lot of, questions of responsibility and of medical, all of these things. Are you aware of anything like that?
Well, this is the thing. Jimmy Sangster, our screenwriter, he was always trying to provide something we hadn't seen before, because he was kind of groomed to be like, don't copy what they did before. And so I think this is kind of one of those hiding in plain sight, something that puts a little more meat on these bones, is that we can have an actual dialogue and we can have characters that aren't black and white. We can empathize with both sides. We see, John Banning's passion for bringing these findings to the world. And at the same time, you have our character of Mehmet, played by George Pastel, who is absolutely justified in, you are robbing our country of its culture. It is written, do not disturb. And what do? You disturb and you exploit. There's just a really great conversation to be had there. And I don't think it gets addressed in other versions of The Mummy in the same way that it does, kind of like front and center. The way that scene between the two of them in Mehmet's drawing room, I just feel is such a powerful, dramatic scene. Like, take the monsters out of it, that dialogue is really incredible.
I don't recall, and maybe you do, Doug, or was the same character as portrayed by Turham Bey, was his motivation the same in the Universal series? Because that character is from that series.
Yes.
It's always right. You disturbed our sacred tomb, you deserve to die.
Yeah.
But they're played a little more cardboard character in that regard. I mean, I think we're not meant to empathize, whereas George Pastel's characterization feels very human and feels very real. And
you may have already touched on this, but when they were excavating the first tombs in Egypt, there was a bunch of stuff about a curse that had been placed there, and then a bunch of the people involved in one of the first expeditions died, and that really turned it into a big thing at the time.
Yeah, they would, every time somebody died, they would run another story of like how once again 20 years later this curse is still, people are still dying. It's unbelievable.
Well, it's interesting in this one, especially the hammer one. It's really not a curse. It's something that a modern man picks up and carries the vengeance for. I think he comes across as very religious in this, and it's a morality issue. I think that he is punishing.
It's interesting to me that they did not follow through with Imhotep's motivation being that she was reincarnated.
Right.
Which I'm wondering, why did they choose not to go further? Why would they just kind of tiptoe there with her resembling her, but not? I mean, I don't know why they thought to let that go. It's such an interesting thing. It certainly sort of draws you back to, Dracula and things like that a little bit with, the reincarnation concepts. But I thought that was strange that they let that plot point go. It's so
eerie. Yeah.
In the Universal film, she was partially Egyptian,
right?
That didn't come in at all in this one either.
Right.
Yeah, it's just kind of dumb luck that she happens to resemble Imhotep's lost love. Like,
but only with her hair down.
It's like, yeah, that's right. You wouldn't notice it if her hair is up.
Kill me if you don't put your.
One of the things that is such a great footnote within this film, which I'm sure Aaron and Doug, and probably all of you, the actor Raymond Huntley, who's playing Joseph Wemple, who's the other archaeologist, is one of the original Draculas, the other stage Dracula from London.
Oh, wow.
Yes, when Lugosi was here doing it on Broadway, he was in America doing the national tour, and he was Dracula in the original London, or in the second London production of the Balderson play.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah. And it's like, oh, wow, my God. Yeah, you look at him and you go, wow, you were Dracula. And then when you look at those funny line drawings, it's like, yeah, it's still there, that face,
Well, some other fun trivia was, this is kind of the last time that Lee did any heavy makeup roles. After Frankenstein and after this one, he was like, enough of that. I'll put in the teeth and I'll put in the contact lenses. That's about it. But when because it's such a physical role, and he had to carry Yvonne Furneaux into the swamp. They had to do like 3 separate takes of that.
Was it him or a stunt double?
Well, they ended up getting Eddie Powell, his stunt double, to finish the job because Lee had strained his back and dislocated his shoulder, I think, going through one of those windows or doors. And also some of the squibs, when they're doing those shotgun blasts, they had gotten a little close to the skin on those. And so he was bruised on those. So it was a very physical shoot, and perhaps not in the way that he had anticipated.
And even if she was a small woman, she was wearing a big, heavy dress.
Yep, that just got heavier.
Yeah, as soon as it got wet. Wow.
One of the great kind of pieces of lore is that Hammer, like many studios, would devise a poster first to kind of sell it to their distributors. And the poster had this great image of like a mob chasing after the mummy with a flashlight, and the light is shining right through the mummy. And Cushing was kind of like, well, what if I were to stab him with this harpoon, and that would create the light that we see, so that there is space in between for the light to shine through. So much like Cushing devising his running down the table and grabbing the curtains off at the end of Horror of Dracula, rather than just another crucifix, Cushing devised that thing with the harpoon, although he's a much less effective hero in this film as opposed to his Van Helsing.
I always liked, to see him and Lee on stage together or on screen together. And I was just, particularly after seeing Hound of the Baskervilles, where they were so good and had so much interaction, here it was, kind of a disappointment, just simply because of the way Lee's role was written.
He's certainly limited by the character.
I always forget what a physical actor he was.
Lee or Cushing?
Cushing.
Oh, yes.
Cushing. Well, Lee, I mean, very much so. I mean, but I always forget. I mean, that moment when Lee hits him and he goes flying into the desk and smashes his head into the box and everything. Yeah. And he's the one who's throwing himself that way.
Right.
I think of him as just more delicate because he's just a smaller stature person, but he surprises you how violent he can be. And also sometimes there's just a tone of malevolence underneath him. It certainly turned up in Dr. Frankenstein, but reappears here, this sort of frustration that boils into anger when he wants to achieve something. He's so surprising to me every time. I mean, I think I first discovered him in Star Wars. That's when I was introduced to him, and then went back to things like him appearing opposite Olivier in Hamlet and going, oh, he's this sort of old school Shakespearean. Is he of the John Gielgud, Ralph Richardson set? And it's like, no, he was an action guy.
Yeah.
It's always really exciting. I find him so interesting. He's surprising.
We always laugh whenever he's being strangled, because that guy gets strangled a lot in his movies. But he's always just whipping his hair around, and the neck and head acting is par excellence.
In general, I mean, I always enjoy seeing Peter Cushing. He's got the face where the moment he's on screen, just the gauntness of it adds something. It strikes me like how much, at least like for the first half, how many times they had to mention, if it wasn't for this damn leg. And I was like, oh, we get it. Your leg doesn't work right. Like, they really had to get that one across.
Well, they knew that Lee wasn't going to be limping, so they're like, well, we got to have somebody limping in this.
Yeah.
Part of it, though, too, with the both of them, and this goes back to certainly all of the greats from Universal, including Lionel Atwill or Henry Daniell or any of those guys, they all had voices.
Yeah.
They had amazing voices. They could speak, and they were unique, and throw Vincent Price into the mix. And it's one of the things with that the best of them all could speak, and if they couldn't, you didn't remember who they were. David Manners, for instance, he didn't have a voice.
My only other thought about this movie has nothing to do with Peter Cushing's acting.
That's okay. We can switch gears.
A logic thing with George Pastel's character. He's so angry at the British people for breaking into the tomb, but he already seems to have Karis well trained. So didn't he himself do the same thing?
As long as they open this tomb, I'll sneak in, grab what I need, and school Karis for the next 3 years.
Train my new pet.
Yep, exactly.
And then put him back in the box when you don't need him.
He's so disappointed when John Banning shows up at his doorstep. He's like, oh man.
I think that's one of the differences, though, between the 32 and the 59. That I don't know, the idea that Imhotep as his later character is self-motivated, whereas the Mummy in the Universal sequels and then in this is turned into this killing assistant.
Yeah.
In the sort of later House of Frankenstein type of things, where it's just like, I get them, type of a thing, or Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, where he's under the control of Dracula. I think it's so much more powerful and emotional in a way because of the fact of Karloff in pursuit of what he wants, as opposed to, because you do wonder then, what was the 3 years, Doug, of training?
Right.
How did he get him? How did the Mummy not kill him on sight?
Right.
Where was the Mummy staying? At Motel 6 while waiting? I mean,
That's just because the audience after the original Mummy, that his first appearance in the bandages is so striking. And then audiences were disappointed that he didn't come back as that. And so that's what they wanted as their monster after that. And we got all the hand curse that followed.
I'm glad you mentioned Abbott and Costello, because as we move into our final film, the 1999 Mummy, I kept thinking, oh man, like this is just a comedy. This is them having fun with the tropes, and like Abbott and Costello, Meet the Mummy, sometimes the jokes land and sometimes they're just like, oh guys, come on.
Yeah.
But yes, 1999's The Mummy, written and directed by Stephen Sommers. It's celebrating its 25th anniversary, and I think that's what I found really. I hadn't seen this film since it first came out in 1999, and looking back at it now, it's interesting to see just kind of like how stuck in its particular time it is.
Yeah.
Same way that the 59 way, in the same way that the 32 one is.
I had forgotten how much it was influenced by the Indiana Jones movies.
Yeah.
In action, in major CGI, and in snark humor throughout the whole thing, and a goofy protagonist who nevertheless can save the woman, at the end.
And costuming.
Right. Yeah.
Oh yeah. The color palette is very similar to Indiana Jones.
I appear regularly on a radio station in Richmond, Virginia, and my producer there, a gentleman named Dan Hobgood, is a Jerry Goldsmith scholar. Goldsmith really disliked this movie intensely, but wrote a wonderful score to it, and really kind of kept everything, all his themes, the way he worked in all of his films, really got them right.
Gavin.
When it first came out, I honestly wasn't super impressed. It's not a movie that stuck with me. I've watched it twice this year, and not on purpose either time. It's sometimes I play what I call Tubi roulette, where I watch a movie and then I let Tubi decide what I'm going to watch next. And it seems to want me to watch The Mummy. I don't think it's a horror film by any stretch.
Right.
But I do think it's interesting to reflect on it now, because at this point, like, Brendan Fraser was like coming out of the Pauly Shore world, but now we know that he actually can be a good actor. So it's interesting to kind of reevaluate like where he was at this point.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about Brendan Fraser's performance for sure, because I found myself going, is he a good actor? He's kind of like that light comedian who knows what notes to hit, but never quite feels, maybe not inspired.
I'm not making the claim he is a good actor. I'm just saying that now that he's got that Oscar behind him, we have to think about him differently than we did in the 90s.
Do we? Doug?
Well, I was really excited when this movie came out because a college friend of mine is in it. Tuck Watkins. He plays Bernard Burns, one of the evil, jerky American guys, the one with glasses. And I wrote to him that we were going to be doing this panel today. And a couple of things I learned from him, and you may already know this, Aaron, but they filmed two whole versions of the movie, an R-rated and a PG-rated.
Oh, wow.
And Universal ended up going with the PG because they thought it would be a broader audience. We said, like, for example, his eyes are pulled out in this movie. In the R-rated movie, it's very bloody. So maybe Gavin, it would be a horror movie. The other thing that interested me that he wrote about, though, is when I watched it, I felt like I was watching CGI the whole way through and nothing was real. But they did film in the Sahara. And he said that, it was filled with snakes and they had snake wranglers. And interestingly, Arnold Vosloo, the actor who played Imhotep, he said, even though he killed us all, when we would be done, we would run to him because he wasn't afraid of all of the critters out there in the desert.
So he was kind of like the bodyguard against nature.
The cool local guy.
Michael.
Well, I think Doug touched on something. What struck me immediately is that it feels like it was intentionally looking to be a PG-13 movie that would appeal to a broad audience. So it was going to be not too much of any one thing. It's got a little bit of, adventure, a little bit of romance, a little bit of horror, at least by saying it's a mummy, and some of the CGI by description of he'll be in pieces and the bugs and all of the other stuff. It feels like a derivative studio vehicle, a project of going, how can we create a series, and make sure that a lot of people will be able to be comfortable watching it, bringing their kids to see it, going on dates to see it, bringing their grandparents to see it. And so it ends up being a lot of unspecificity. Also, I think it's interesting. It's in the earlier years of CGI.
Oh yeah,
which some of it looks good and some of it looks not so good, and some of it is just like, okay, one more time with his mouth dropping open and all of that. It's like, we get it. That was scary or surprising the first time. As far as Brendan Fraser goes, there's an element about him, and I think you're right, Gavin. It takes a good actor to be as interesting as he is in this sort of Cary Grant way, and that's what he sort of is. I mean, coming from George of the Jungle and these other comical things, but it's a matter of degrees. To compare it to Indiana Jones, some of the direction, just a little bit more in this direction or that direction, might have made it feel more like Indiana Jones in a scary way, the way Indiana Jones can be scary and disturbing. And they just said, yeah, no, not quite there. Pull it back and cut to the pretty girl again, and with her goofy, shenanigans going on.
Yeah, and Stephen Sommers is he's a monster kid. Like he really enjoys these movies. I mean, I cannot stand Van Helsing, but I get that his heart was in the right place and that he really wanted to breathe new life into these universal monsters. And you get the sense, if you've seen his film Deep Rising, which preceded this one, it has that same sense of fun and scares and CGI monsters and an ensemble that is full of wisecracking, characters. So this feels very much like a Stephen Sommers film in that regard. And I do feel like he was saying, how can I do a horror film that will appeal to the masses? And it's interesting. We talk about it being, I'm like, I don't know how any R-rated movie would have gone over, considering the kind of low-level comedy and slapstick that seems to be appealing to the kids in the same way that Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy would have. It's like, we're going to tell these really dumb jokes, but then we're going to rip somebody's eyes out, in explicit fashion. I'm kind of like, the tone feels just kind of all over the place in that regard.
I think the movie was done in by its budget. I mean, it's just too big.
Sure.
If they had just cut a lot of the stuff out of it and stuck to either a straight Indiana Jones adventure or a horror movie or even a comedy, it would have been a lot better.
Not to put too much praise to the genius of Abbott and Costello, but what they always got right in their horror movies is that the monsters played it straight.
Yes.
They never made fun of the monsters, And
I think that's true here, too. I mean, the monsters don't really get the jokes here. It's people's reactions to the monsters.
I would agree.
And the first, that nice set piece that establishes her as such a goofy character, knocking all of the cabinets over. That was a really nicely done piece. And, I'd like to have seen more of that throughout the rest of it.
Well, and I even like the opening, 7-minute prologue, which is interesting. We get it at the beginning as opposed to being a flashback. But I really think that prologue is really exciting and fun, sets a tone. And then we get, kind of the monstrous face in the sand that leads into the title card. As I was sitting in, I'm like, oh, this maybe this is better than I remembered it. And maybe and now I recall that it was kind of the excess of humor. It feels like nobody is taking any of this really seriously. Along with that, though, there's so much murder in this movie. Like there's so many people getting killed, oftentimes by the Americans and the Brits. Like the expendable Egyptian quotient is pretty high here.
Well, and I think it takes a little bit away from the threat of the mummy himself.
Right.
Because everybody's killing everybody all the time. That you don't have that doom of Christopher Lee smashing through the door and go, this isn't happening next door.
Right. But you talked about Rachel Weisz's character. Everybody is playing it kind of as that light melodrama. Like nobody feels with the exception of Arnold Vosloo and Oded Fehr, our two kind of main Egyptian characters, they feel grounded. They're not asked to do very much, but they feel like they're actually invested in the situation, whereas everyone else feels like they're kind of treating it like this is a wild adventure we're on. You know what I mean?
Her brother, that character exists mostly as a funny sidekick.
Yep. Also, they're all funny sidekicks.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes they are funny and they are charming, but it does feel like they're all just there to make jokes.
She did some nice kind of, reminded me of Lucille Ball stuff.
I was going back and looking at some of the reviews from the time, and it does seem like this actually landed pretty well. And I do remember enjoying it at the time. I remember thinking this was enjoyable, and I watched the sequels, but I never went back to it. And I think that's because, didn't feel like maybe there was a lot to go back to.
Yeah, it's a good popcorn movie.
But that's just maybe it is they've succeeded at what they were looking to achieve,
right,
which was to create a popular success that would have a lot of fun visuals with the new toys that they had in Hollywood.
Sure.
And for the studio to be able to go, great, we can totally, they liked it, we're going to give them 3 more, and who knows where they were in terms of even contemplating, around the same time with the Branagh Frankenstein that had come out, and Dracula, and the Wolfman, or the Wolf with Nicholson, were they in the early stages of going, maybe dark universe is this, what, how can we tie all of this stuff together?
It's interesting that Lord of the Rings is 2 years away. Fellowship of the Ring is going to come out in 2001, and I have not gone back to revisit that in a little while on a big screen. But I remember thinking the CGI in that, just in 2 years, feels like a quantum jump ahead from what we're looking at here.
And that's because of Peter Jackson. He was really working hard on that stuff. And remember, what's the name of that? The great little horror movie he did about the ghosts.
The Frighteners.
Yeah, the Frighteners. I interviewed him at the time, and he was talking about how they were able to do so much with those effects, and he thought they were going to be doing better stuff than Titanic.
But kind of to your point, Gavin, I mean, I think we do have some horror elements, and I think that's just it. Like it's an action comedy horror, but there's definitely some stuff in there that feels like it's there for the horror fans.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's The Mummy, and it does have those moments, but it is an Indiana Jones, knockoff, or not even a knockoff, but definitely in that same world. And I'm not going to say that Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark, is horror because guys' faces melt off when they open the Ark. I don't know where that line is exactly, but it's just too light and too action adventure for me to accept it, even with a mummy. So I don't know. I don't draw that line, but to me, it's not. Whatever that line is, it's not there.
Well, like the scarab beetles burrowing into people, and our guys who melt with the ancient booby traps, our resurrected priests who all have a limp, by the way. So that's our theme for the day. But yeah, I think that's an interesting question, Gavin. Is what necessarily makes is it because is Love at First Bite a horror film because it has a vampire in it? It's clearly its intentions are very different than other vampire films, but because it has a vampire, it gets lumped in as a horror film.
I've always used the kind of overly simple requirement of if the film's primary mission is to scare you, it's a horror film.
Right.
And that's, if it's doing all the other things too, then it's not really a horror film anymore.
Well, before you showed up, Mike, we were talking about your book, The Horror Show, talks about Apocalypse Now and includes that as a horror film. And I still remember reading that and going, now I have to think about it in a completely different way.
And I have had to defend that inclusion. And,
I'm not surprised.
There are some other films in there that perhaps should not have been. But I to this day think that Apocalypse Now is trying to frighten you all the way through. And the farther they get down the river, the more frightening and nightmarish it gets.
And I'm more accepting of that. That I won't even fight you on, because I can see like the overly oppressive nature of the whole thing. Like if you take it for what it is, it's not a comfortable film. So yeah, I don't have a problem with that at all.
The success of the 1999 Mummy did spawn sequels and spin-offs with the Scorpion King, and all of the movies that we've discussed today, they all had series that sprung up in their wake. You know, we had the Universal mummies, we had the Hammer mummies, and we had the later Universal mummies, you know, coming out of this film. And considering that the Mummy isn't, as we talked about, like the most dynamic of monsters, how do we explain that? How do we explain that studios keep going, well, we should probably do another Mummy movie?
I think a lot of great horror movies ride the line between life and death. And certainly the whole image of the mummy, a resurrected person, is frightening, I think. And even if it's moving slowly, it's coming at you. Among the movies I watched in prep for this was the 15-minute Three Stooges Mummies Dummies. even that plays on that, though. Not the dead part, but the slowly moving toward you.
I think it also has to do with you're able to travel to this exotic place and time that has magic and a set of rules that need to be adhered to. And if you break the rules, there are ramifications of those rules. And it's the classic stranger in a strange land. Most of the people that we are following tend to be either Americans or Brits in that environment. We're not dealing with their own local politics. It is, you know, it is associations closer to the Wizard of Oz or something like that, of somebody going to another land and then needing to understand the rules and who are the players and how they're playing each other and, you know, all of that. I think that's why it keeps coming back. But I do wonder in that same sense that once the 50s hit, and I think that they would probably look back at that time and go, yeah, Dracula, Frankenstein, that's all corny. Were they afraid in 99 that you couldn't actually make a legitimately scary mummy movie? And they've got to pull their, you know, how will anybody buy this? Would anybody really buy into the lore and get scared? So let's make it an action adventure romantic thing that, you know, people can hang on to each other in the theater but not be genuinely terrified.
Kind of along with that exoticism that I think it's a great point. And also when it does take place on American shores, you know, we have an exotic monster, you know, from a land that we don't understand, that has customs we don't understand. You know, it's similar to our zombie lore, where it's like, this is something that is forces that are beyond our Western understanding. And there's an ancientness to it. It calls back to a kind of a classic horror.
I like the idea that in the 90s, maybe the idea of a scary mummy wasn't something they thought possible. And I'm thinking, is it? I don't know. Like, I feel like it could be, but I don't know what that concept would be. Now, granted, I haven't seen the Tom Cruise movie, so maybe it's terrifying. You don't see a lot of mummies anymore.
Right.
Interestingly, in 1999, the same year as this kind of jokey mummy, was the Blair Witch Project. What's frightening is what you don't know.
There's a Korean film called Exhuma, EXHUMA, that just recently came out. It's on Shudder now. And it is basically a mummy movie without being a mummy, because you have a grave that is unearthed, you have something that escapes from the coffin, and then you have people trying to basically put the genie back in the bottle. Really excellently done, incredible production value and acting and things like that. So it's for mummy fans out there, I highly recommend Exhuma. It has all the mummy tropes without a mummy in sight, but all of the things that make a mummy movie great, it has in spades. Well, thank you all so much. It's a fantastic conversation, and lovely to see our classic horror fans together again. Looking forward to having you all on again very soon. And until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.